There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a neighborhood on Christmas Eve. It is usually a comfortable silence. It is the sound of families retreating indoors, of front doors locking against the cold, of a collective, unspoken agreement that for the next 12 hours, the outside world does not exist. On the 200 block of Rash Lane in Terrell, Texas, that silence was in full effect. It was late afternoon on December 24th, 2025. The sun was beginning to dip. To the casual observer, the single-story brick house in the middle of the block looked exactly like the others. There were likely decorations. There were cars in the driveway. There was every indication of a holiday gathering in progress. But just a few yards away, in an open garage, a neighbor named Stephanie Turner was laughing. She was hosting a party. There was food. There were people in the yard. They were celebrating the peak of the holiday season, completely unaware that they were standing within earshot of a massacre. This is the first deception of the suburbs, the belief that proximity equals knowledge. We assume that if something catastrophic were happening 30 feet away, we would feel it. We would hear it. But on Rash Lane, nobody heard a thing. The violence did not scream, it whispered. And by the time the sun went down, for people were already gone. When the police finally arrived at 5:29 p.m., they didn't come with SWAT teams. They didn't kick down the door. They arrived responding to a welfare check. In the hierarchy of police calls, a welfare check is usually mundane. It is a request to check on an elderly relative who isn't answering the phone or a neighbor whose mail is piling up. But a welfare check at 5:30 p.m. on Christmas Eve is different. Christmas Eve is a deadline. It is a time of mandatory presence. If someone is missing on a Tuesday in November, it might be an oversight. If someone is unreachable on Christmas Eve, it implies a breach of contract. The call suggests that someone, somewhere outside that house, knew that the silence inside wasn't peaceful. They knew a schedule had been broken. What the officers found inside was not a robbery gone wrong. There were no broken windows. There were no kicked-in doors. The house was secure. The threat had not broken in. It had been invited in. It had been given a plate at the table. This changes the nature of the fear. The terror of Rash Lane isn't that a stranger came into a good neighborhood. It's that the people inside the house were likely smiling at the person who was about to end them. The investigation would later reveal that 3 adults and 1 child were dead. The police would label it a murder-suicide, a clinical term that explains the mechanics but ignores the psychology. Because to kill an entire family to watch them fall, one by one, and then turn the weapon on yourself requires a specific kind of detachment. It requires the perpetrator to look at the people they supposedly love and see them not as human beings, but as problems to be solved. The police found the bodies quickly. They secured the weapon. But as the neighbors stood on their lawns, watching the coroner's vans back into the driveway under the glow of Christmas lights, a different question began to form. It wasn't about how it happened. The ballistics would explain that. The question was about the timeline. Because based on the silence, and based on the festive atmosphere just 1 driveway over, it is very likely that the family lay dead inside that house for hours while the neighborhood celebrated around them. The party next door didn't stop because the violence started. The party stopped because someone finally looked through the window. And what they saw didn't look like a crime scene. It looked like a stillness that was simply too heavy to be natural. From a distance, there was nothing unusual about that street. A short run of houses, each shaped from the same ideas about comfort and stability. Single-story brick, small front lawns, driveways that looked like they belonged to people who planned to stay. It was the sort of place that people described with phrases like good neighborhood and meant it. On Christmas Eve, that description felt especially true. One garage door was open, turned into an extra room for the night. Family and friends sat in folding chairs, moved between tables, refilled plates. Conversations overlapped in a low, steady hum. Someone laughed, a little louder than everyone else, and then the sound softened back into the general warmth of the evening. Nothing about that scene suggested that the block was unsafe. In fact, it suggested the opposite. People do not hold gatherings with doors open and children moving freely in places they believe to be dangerous. A neighborhood only earns the label good when people have lived long stretches of time without expecting harm. The house that would later appear in headlines sat on that same stretch of road, almost indistinguishable at a glance. It belonged to a woman in her early 60s, someone whose name would eventually be listed among the dead. That night, her home was not an anonymous building. It was the meeting point for people arriving from different directions, each with their own starting place. One older man came in from another nearby town. A 12-year-old boy traveled from a different community altogether. An adult son, in his late 30s, drove in from yet another city. None of those drives were long enough to feel like a journey, but each required intention. Plans had been made, times had been agreed on. People had chosen to spend that evening together in that specific room. When families plan these gatherings, there is an unspoken contract underneath the logistics. People say, "I'll be there," and everyone else begins to build the night around that promise. Food is prepared with those faces in mind. Extra chairs are added with those bodies in mind. The emotional tone of the evening adjusts to who is expected to walk through the door. That is why absence feels different on holidays. On any other night, a delayed arrival can be shrugged off. On Christmas Eve, a missing person is a disruption to the script. Even if no one says it out loud at first, the questions begin to gather. Where are they? Has anyone heard from them? Did something happen on the way? Somewhere beyond that block, those questions built enough pressure to turn into action. Someone looked at the time, thought about what had been promised, and realized that the silence had lasted longer than it should. Instead of waiting it out, they reached for the option that sits between panic and denial. They asked the police to go and check. For the officers on duty, it was another call on a busy evening. A request to look in on someone at an address in a neighborhood with no obvious signs of trouble. No reports of shouting, no reports of gunfire. No immediate history of crisis tied to that house. Just a location, a time, and a simple concern that something felt off. When they arrived, the street looked calm. One home open and active, another closed and quiet. Cars in driveways, decorations likely still in place. To these senses mentality. The stillness of the house in question could have meant that the occupants were watching a movie, saying grace, or simply enjoying a private moment. That is part of what makes this case difficult to sit with. How normal everything would have appeared in the exact moment when normality had already disappeared inside. The only difference that mattered was the one detail no one outside could see. Behind that ordinary door, the evening had already ended. For people were inside, and none of them were alive. 3 had been killed by someone they knew. The fourth had chosen to end his own life after ending theirs. In the days that followed, the street had to absorb that reality. Neighbors repeated that it was a good area, that people cared about one another, that this sort of thing did not happen there. The repetition carried its own unease, as if they were trying to pull the neighborhood's old identity back over what had been revealed. If a place that felt this safe could hold something so different behind one closed door, what does good neighborhood really protect anyone from? If someone far away sensed that something was wrong before anyone on that street did, what was the first small detail that shifted in their mind from ordinary delay to genuine alarm? And for the people who now drive past that house every day, knowing what they know, does the street ever truly return to what it was? Or has some quiet part of their sense of safety been permanently, if subtly, altered? By the time, for people are found dead inside a single home, it is natural to look backward and search for a moment when everything clearly began to go wrong. A raised voice, a slammed door, a public scene, something that would mark the starting point of a straight line toward disaster. In this case, that line is not visible from the outside. There are no widely documented accounts of raging confrontations in front yards. No long history of police cars regularly visiting the address. No public trail of escalating threats. What exists, instead, is a more unsettling possibility that whatever brought these four people to their final evening together was unfolding quietly, over time, in ways that did not announce themselves. Consider the simple fact that the adults in this story did not live under one roof. The older man lived in one town. The woman who hosted the gathering lived on Rash Lane. The adult son had his own address in another city. The 12-year-old boy came from yet another place. Separate homes, separate routines, separate daily lives, all converging for a single holiday event. On the surface, that looks ordinary. Many families are spread across nearby towns, coming together for holidays, and then dispersing again. But physical distance can do two things at once. It can reduce day-to-day friction, and it can also make it easier for family members to misunderstand how the others are truly doing. A weekly phone call can make someone sound stable who is, in reality, barely holding themselves together. A brief visit can conceal more than it reveals. The gaps between what people show and what they are carrying internally can widen without anyone realizing it, especially when face-to-face contact is limited to special occasions. Inside that gap, small shifts can occur, almost invisibly. A person might become quieter on calls, but blame it on being tired. They might avoid certain topics, or change the subject when the conversation turns toward their work, their finances, or their relationships. They might agree to come for the holidays with a kind of resigned politeness that others interpret as normal reluctance. From the outside, none of these behaviors are dramatic enough to raise alarms on their own. Taken together, though, they can signal that something inside a person is tightening. A sense of failure, or resentment or hopelessness can grow in private, while outward behavior remains largely unchanged. For an adult child in his late 30s, returning to a parent's home on a holiday can carry extra weight. The house is familiar, but the role is not. He is no longer a teenager, yet the physical space can pull him back into old patterns of expectation and comparison. Conversations about work, stability, or responsibility can land more heavily when they are framed by walls that once witnessed earlier versions of the same themes. If there were unresolved tensions over money, over perceived disappointments, over family decisions made years earlier, they would not need to be shouted to be felt. A single remark, a look, or a change in tone can be enough to reopen old frustrations. In a setting that is supposed to be cheerful, those undercurrents can feel even sharper. At the same time, the presence of a 12-year-old boy introduces a different emotional layer. Children can act as both a bridge and a mirror. Adults may try to hold themselves together in front of them, to preserve some sense of normalcy, even when they are internally spiraling. Or, in some cases, the child's presence might intensify feelings of inadequacy or loss, reminding an adult of what they believe they have failed to provide or protect. None of this is a confirmed script of what happened inside that house. What is known is that 3 generations were present: an older man, an older woman, an adult son, and a child. That configuration alone carries potential for layered, unspoken pressures. Expectations from one generation, perceived judgments from another, and the silent observation of the youngest, caught in the middle. In many cases of a person turning on their family. Those who knew them later describe a kind of quiet change leading up to the event. Not an explosive decline, but a subtle narrowing. Less time with friends, less openness. A preoccupation with certain grievances. A tendency to see fewer options for resolving problems. A hardening of perspective that the people around them either do not notice or do not fully understand. From the outside, that can look like someone simply withdrawing a little. From the inside, it can feel like a gradual closing of doors, until only one remains. The most discomforting part of examining a night like the one on Rash Lane is that there may not have been a single, observable turning point. The moment when conversation shifted into confrontation, or when thoughts became actions, might have passed in seconds. Buried deep in a private exchange that no one will ever fully reconstruct. If those close to the people in that house were asked about the weeks leading up to Christmas, what small changes would they remember only now, with the benefit of hindsight? Were there invitations declined that would normally have been accepted, or silences in conversations that used to be easy? Did anyone feel, even briefly, that something in one person's eyes or voice seemed different, and then dismiss that feeling as overthinking because nothing obvious had yet gone wrong? At some stage on that Christmas Eve, the line between possibility and finality was crossed inside the house on Rash Lane. There was a moment brief, almost certainly quiet, when it was still possible for everyone in that home to leave alive. After that moment, it was not. From the outside, the sequence of events is known only in fragments. For people were found inside: an older man, an older woman, a 12-year-old boy, and an adult son who brought the firearm and ultimately used it on himself after using it on the others. The official classification calls it a triple homicide, followed by self-inflicted injury. That label tells us what happened. It does not tell us how it felt to anyone in the room as the situation shifted. In many events like this, the transition from tense conversation to irreversible action is much shorter than people imagine. There is not always a prolonged argument or a clear, shouted declaration. Instead, there can be a moment of decision that happens entirely inside one person's mind. A thought that moves from I could to I will, crossing a threshold that everyone else in the room has no idea even exists until it is already behind them. If a weapon was present in that home, there are only a few ways it could have been there. It could have belonged to the house and been retrieved from another room. It could have been brought in by the adult son, already on his person when he arrived. The difference between those two possibilities speaks to timing. In one scenario, a decision is made during the visit. In the other, The potential for harm was present the moment he walked through the door. Either way, the moment the weapon appeared would have changed the entire emotional landscape of the room. Until then, whatever tensions existed could still be contained in words, in expressions, in familiar family dynamics. Once a firearm is visible, everything rearranges around it. The hierarchy of the space shifts. The person holding it controls more than the conversation. They control the next seconds of everyone's life. It is tempting to imagine dramatic scenes, frantic pleading, raised voices, last-minute negotiations. In reality, many of these events unfold in a restrained, almost mechanical way. The person who has committed internally to an irreversible act can become strangely calm. In some cases, that calmness is what allows them to carry out their intention quickly, before anyone else has fully registered what is happening. There are few certainties about the exact order in which the people in that house sustained fatal injuries. In similar cases, it is not uncommon for the adult targets to be attacked first, either because they are perceived as the source of grievance or because they are the ones most capable of resistance. The presence of a child adds an entirely different layer of complexity, but it also adds difficulty to the sequence reconstruction. Did the child understand what was happening? Was he harmed first, last, or somewhere in between? Each possibility carries its own weight. What is known from patterns in other incidents is that children in these situations are rarely harmed by chance. Their presence is either ignored in a moment of focused rage or deliberately included in a larger, distorted logic in which the perpetrator decides that no one in the family will be allowed to continue beyond whatever point they believe has been reached. That decision, once made, is not easily undone. After the first injury, the atmosphere in the house would have changed permanently. Sound compresses time in memory. For anyone still alive after that first moment, the following seconds would likely have felt stretched and fragmented at the same time. The layout of the rooms, the distance between them, the positions of doorways and furniture, all of it, would have suddenly mattered in ways it never had before. Yet, from the perspective of the person holding the weapon, the mental landscape might have narrowed instead of expanded. When someone reaches a state where they view harm to themselves and others as a combined, final act, the world can reduce to a single track. Carry out the plan. Complete the sequence. Remove all witnesses. Remove themselves. There is no imagined future beyond the next few minutes. That constriction can make what they are doing feel, in their own mind, strangely inevitable. At some point after the other injuries occurred, the adult son sustained a fatal self-inflicted wound. There was no attempt to flee, no effort to construct an alternate story or stage the scene to mislead investigators. The act ended where it began, inside the same home with the same weapon. In that sense, the event was closed by the same hand that opened it. From the outside, this can raise a deeply uncomfortable set of questions. If the intention was always to end his own life, at what stage did the decision expand to include the harm of the others in the house? Was there a brief period earlier that day when he imagined a version of the night in which he left quietly after dinner and carried out his intention alone, somewhere else? Or had the idea of causing harm not only to himself, but to these specific people been forming for longer than anyone around him realized, waiting for a moment like this holiday gathering when all of them would be in one place, behind a single door, unaware that their presence together was the final condition he believed he needed? Once the emergency vehicles left Rash Lane and the tape came down, the house did not immediately become a story. It became a fight of Kazi, A place investigators returned to again and again, trying to piece together how four lives had come to an end in a single evening. From the outside, it might seem as if the case was straightforward. One person caused the deaths of three others, then did not survive the event himself. There was no unknown suspect to pursue, no ongoing threat to the public. In official terms, that allows a case to be cleared quickly. But clearing a case, on paper, is very different from understanding it in any meaningful way. Detectives still had to move slowly through each room, noting the smallest details. Where each person had been found, what objects were in reach, whether anything in the home appeared disturbed or out of place. They had to examine the position of the firearm, the spent casings, the patterns that would help them reconstruct the sequence. Even if no one outside the investigation would ever see that reconstruction in its full detail. At the same time, other investigators and officers began a quieter kind of work, conversations. They reached out to relatives in Kaufman, in Forney, in Wills Point. They spoke to neighbors on Rash Lane. They contacted employers, friends, and anyone else who might hold a fragment of information that could help explain the hours, days, or months leading up to Christmas Eve. Each person they spoke with brought their own perspective. Some may have described the older man as steady, dependable, perhaps even predictable. Others might have seen the woman who lived on Rash Lane as a constant in their lives. The person who hosted gatherings and held things together. Someone else might have spoken of the 12-year-old boy in the simple, painful language reserved for children whose futures are cut short, gentle, energetic, kind. When the conversations turned to the adult son, the picture would likely have become more complicated. People might have described him as quiet, private, sometimes distant. Or perhaps they remembered him as helpful and polite, someone who did what was expected without making a scene. It is rare, in cases like this, for the people closest to the individual to describe a cartoon villain. More often, they describe a person who seemed off in ways that were easy to rationalize at the time. Investigators would have listened for specific patterns. Were there recent changes in work status? Any mention of financial strain? Had he spoken about feeling trapped, or overwhelmed, or ashamed? Were there references to disagreements with family members that had begun to intensify? Did anyone recall comments that, in hindsight, sounded like a person saying goodbye? These questions are not just procedural, they are also psychological. The goal is not to assign blame to any one moment, but to see whether a series of pressure points can be traced, places where intervention might have been possible, even if it was never attempted because the risk did not yet seem obvious. Alongside those interviews, investigators had to decide what to share with the public and what to keep within the case file. They confirmed that the deaths were the result of a triple killing followed by the perpetrator's own death. They released the names of the adults. They disclosed the age and home city of the child, but held back his name at the family's request. They acknowledged that the case was active, that they were still gathering facts, and that there was no known broader danger to the community. What they did not release was a motive. Not because the word itself was being withheld as a tactic, but because nothing had yet emerged that could be stated with confidence as the central reason. There was no public record of a recent divorce proceeding between the adults. No widely reported business collapse. No single event that could be pointed to and declared the cause. In that absence, people watching from the outside began to construct their own explanations. Some assumed mental collapse, imagining a sudden break from reality. Others leaned toward hidden financial strain or a long-simmering resentment, finally boiling over. Some quietly wondered about substance use, or untreated illness, or family conflict that never reached public view. Each of those theories says as much about the person holding it as it does about the case itself. When a reason is not provided, the human mind rushes to fill the gap with whatever it finds most plausible based on past experiences and fears. In this way, the investigation did not only live in official reports. It extended into living rooms, workplaces, and group conversations where people tried to make sense of what they had heard. For those who actually knew the people in that house, the lack of a clear answer came with a different kind of cost. It meant that every interaction they could remember, every visit, every phone call, every missed sign was now subject to re-examination. Did a certain remark reveal more than they thought at the time? Did a particular silence mean he was struggling when they had assumed he was simply tired? The community on Rash Lane faced its own version of this process. Some likely asked themselves whether anything about the adults' comings and goings had seemed unusual in the weeks before. Whether there had been fewer hellos, fewer casual conversations at the mailbox. Whether anyone had noticed a subtle withdrawal, then decided it was not their place to ask why. As the official investigation continued, each new piece of information answered one question, while leaving others intact. Yes, the firearm had been found near the adult son. Yes, there were no signs of forced entry. Yes, the working theory remained that he had been responsible for the others' deaths before his own. But the core questions why that night, in that house with those people, remained stubbornly open. If a complete explanation never emerges, what does that mean for the people left to live with the outcome? Can there be genuine accountability in a case where the person who caused the harm is no longer alive to face legal consequences? And where the reasons behind their decision may be scattered across memories that will never be fully collected? And when a community learns that something this irreversible can happen without obvious warning on a street they once called safe, how does that knowledge quietly alter the way they interpret every unanswered call, every closed door, and every small, uneasy feeling that they might previously have ignored? In the days after the incident, the house on Rash Lane remained standing, but it no longer existed in the way it once had. It was still physically present, a structure of brick, drywall, and roofing, but its meaning had been altered permanently. For investigators, it became a location tied to case numbers and reports. For the families of the people who died there, it became a fixed point in their personal timelines. The place where everything before and everything after would forever be divided. The formal outcome of the case was, in one sense, swift and irreversible. The person identified as responsible for the deaths of the others did not survive. That meant there would be no arrest, no trial, no sentencing. On paper, the file could eventually be marked in a way that indicated there was no one left to pursue. The legal system had reached its limit, not because all questions were answered, but because the only person who could be held directly accountable was gone. For the relatives of the older man and woman, that may have created a strange, hollow kind of resolution. They had confirmation of what had happened. They knew who had been present. They knew that there would never be a chance to sit in a courtroom and watch testimony, to hear a defense, or to listen to a judge speak from the bench. There would be no moment when a verdict was read, no official recognition of guilt beyond the language of a final report. The family of the 12-year-old boy faced an additional layer of exposure and protection. On one hand, their loss was part of a public story, mentioned in news segments and articles. On the other hand, his name was deliberately not released, at their request, allowing him a measure of privacy in death that the adults did not have. He was present in the narrative as an age, a hometown, a role within a broader event. But his identity remained, shielded from wider consumption. That anonymity can be both a comfort and a burden. It protects the child from becoming a symbol in a way the family cannot control. Yet it also means that, for many people, he will exist only as a number and a vague outline. The people who actually knew him who remember his face, his voice, his preferences must carry those details largely in private, even as the case itself continues to be discussed in public language. The neighborhood, meanwhile, had to absorb the knowledge that their street had been the setting for a complete family collapse. Some residents might have considered moving, feeling that the association was too heavy to live with day after day. Others stayed, adapting slowly to the way the house's presence felt over time. Even if new occupants eventually moved in, the awareness of what had once happened there would not simply disappear with a fresh coat of paint or a different car in the driveway. Beyond Rash Lane, the case joined a small but deeply unsettling category of events. Situations in which a person ends their own life only after ending the lives of those closest to them. Researchers and advocates who study family violence and intimate harm folded this incident into broader patterns, noting the timing around a major holiday, amid other domestic incidents in the region and the configuration of the victims, multiple generations gathered under one roof. In that larger context, the Terrell case did not stand alone. It sat alongside other tragedies in which holidays, financial pressure, relational strain, and untreated psychological distress converged in ways that outsiders struggled to understand. Yet, even when placed in that wider frame, there remained something stubbornly opaque about this particular event. No widely shared document explained a precipitating fight, a recent legal dispute, or a clear triggering loss. That lack of a named motive leaves a kind of residue. People may feel that they are circling an invisible center, certain that something was there, but unable to touch it. Families can generate tentative explanations that help them make sense of what happened. But those explanations rarely feel entirely satisfying. There is always the possibility that a crucial thought, a private decision, or a final internal justification died with the person who acted on it. For the wider audience that later encounters this case in articles, brief news clips, or passing conversations, the story tends to compress into a simple summary for members of an extended family gathered for a holiday. And none of them survived. The details behind those words, decades of relationship dynamics, personal struggles, quiet disappointments, small joys are almost entirely invisible from that distance. The absence of a courtroom narrative means there is no official, public story to settle on. Instead, the event lives as a cluster of confirmed facts, surrounded by a wide ring of uncertainty. Some people will live the rest of their lives believing they know why it happened. Others will accept that they never will. If there is any lasting shift that emerges from looking closely at a case like this, it may not be located in the specifics of this family alone. It may be found in the questions it leaves behind about the people around us, the ones who appear to be managing, the ones who come home for holidays, the ones who sit quietly at the edges of gatherings. When those people say they are fine, or when they retreat slightly from contact, How do we decide whether to accept that surface answer or to gently press further? And in a world where harm of this scale can occur behind a familiar door, on a street described as safe, is it possible to increase our awareness of quiet distress without collapsing into constant suspicion, or will some level of unseeable risk remain, no matter how carefully we try to look? There are stories that resolve themselves. Stories where the ending arrives clean and the remaining questions feel like natural loose threads in an otherwise complete narrative. This is not one of those stories. The Terrell case does not conclude so much as it stops, leaving behind something that continues to move in the silence. The legal system has rendered its verdict, though there was no trial. The police investigation continues in the quiet way that cases continue, when the person responsible is beyond the reach of consequence. The families have begun the long, invisible work of carrying grief that arrived suddenly and with no chance to prepare, to prevent, or to say anything at all. Yet the case remains open in another sense entirely. It lives in the memories of everyone who heard about it and felt that small jolt of recognition, the moment when the distance between a safe, ordinary life and total catastrophe contracted to nothing. It persists in the minds of anyone who has ever sat across from a family member during a holiday gathering and wondered, without quite admitting it, whether the person in front of them was struggling in a way they could not see. In the weeks and months following Christmas Eve, the North Texas region experienced a notable spike in domestic incidents. The cluster that included the Terrell tragedy, the events in Grand Prairie and McKinney just days apart, spoke to something larger than individual cases. Mental health professionals and advocates who study intimate violence pointed to the holidays themselves as a kind of pressure system, where isolation, financial stress, substance use, and strained relationships converge in ways that can become lethal. But knowing that broader pattern does not change the singular weight of what happened on one street in one town. The knowledge that family violence clusters around December does not make it easier to live in a neighborhood where one person was unexpectedly driven to eliminate everyone they believed defined their failure. One of the most difficult aspects of cases like this is that they offer no redemptive narrative. There is no hero who saw the warning signs and intervened. There is no moment where the trajectory was altered by a single conversation or a chance encounter. There is only the fact that a situation developed, moved past every possible threshold of prevention, and ended in a way that cannot be reversed. The people who lived closest to this event, the neighbors on Rash Lane, the relatives in nearby towns, the friends and colleagues of the adults now carry knowledge that will reshape how they experience future gatherings, future holidays, future moments of contact with people they thought they knew. That reshaping is not always conscious. It might surface as a slight hesitation before asking someone directly how they are doing, or as a quieter attention to the spaces where someone is not saying anything at all. For the 12-year-old boy, who never had a chance to become a person with a public name or a full biography in news reports, the loss is absolute. He will not grow older. He will not have experiences that distance him from this night or heal from it. He simply exists now in the category of children lost to family violence, known only to the people who held him in life and hold his memory now. That finality is what makes these cases so difficult to move past. There is no appeal, no correction, no second chance waiting somewhere in the future. What was taken cannot be restored. What was not done cannot now be attempted. The house on Rash Lane, depending on what has happened to it, since that night. Either stands still as a private residence occupied perhaps by new people who may or may not know its recent history, or it remains empty, waiting for time to pass and memory to fade. Either way, it continues to exist as a fixed point on a map, a specific address that no longer feels like just an address. Some people will drive past it without knowing what happened there. Others will always know, will always carry a small weight when they think about it or pass near it. Still others have moved away, unable to reconcile their sense of home with the knowledge of what occurred in one of its ordinary brick structures. If there is a conclusion to draw from this case, it is not about solutions or systems that failed. It is about the limits of what outsiders can understand about any household. The quiet arrangements that people make with each other behind closed doors. The resentments they choose not to voice, the dreams they abandon without announcement. The slow ways they come to see their own lives as intolerable. The most haunting truth may be the simplest one, for people gathered for a holiday. And none of them could have predicted that it would be their last gathering. Even if they had suspected something was amiss, even if they had felt the undercurrent of tension, there was likely no moment when they believed the evening would end in absolute erasure. They probably thought, as people do on Christmas Eve, that they would see each other again, that there would be other holidays, other dinners, other chances to repair or simply endure what was broken or strained between them. They likely imagined a future that included continuation. What happened instead was that continuation stopped. Not gradually, not with warning, but suddenly and irrevocably. The neighborhood returned to its normal rhythms. The police closed their active files. The families began the process of grieving without answers, of living forward while carrying the weight of questions that may never be resolved. And somewhere, in Texas, on an ordinary street in a place people once called safe, a house stands with knowledge of what happened inside it, knowledge it cannot speak, knowledge that touches everyone who knows it in different ways. And in ways that will continue to unfold long after this story has stopped being news. The silence that fell on Rash Lane on Christmas Eve did not lift when the police left. It simply took on a different texture, one that will carry forward into seasons and years. A reminder that the distance between celebration and catastrophe can sometimes be measured only in the space between one moment and the next. And that some families do not survive the gathering they thought would hold them together. Quiet crime stories. Some questions are answered in court. Some are answered by time. And some are never answered at all. The silence they leave behind becomes part of the story itself, a weight that those who were close to it will carry. And that those who never knew these people can only approach with the understanding that behind many ordinary doors, things are happening that no one outside will ever fully know. Thank you for listening.